Spring of 1939, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. A young physics student named Richard Feynman walks into John Wheeler's quantum mechanics class. Around him, 19 other students lean forward, pens moving frantically across paper, desperate to capture each symbol Wheeler writes before the chalk dust settles. Feynman's page stays empty, not because he's struggling to keep up. Empty because he's made a deliberate choice that seems foolish to everyone watching. 3 weeks later, his classmates are still memorizing equations. Feynman has already solved the problems they're preparing for. His notebook? Still mostly blank, just a few scattered thoughts in the margins. When the examination comes, something strange emerges. The students with meticulous, color-coded notes stumble. Feynman, working from almost nothing, demonstrates a grasp of the material that runs fundamentally deeper. This wasn't genius, it was methodology, one that would eventually contribute to a Nobel Prize. A system of learning that schools don't teach, perhaps because it reveals something uncomfortable about how education actually functions. Traditional schooling teaches consumption. Feynman's system demanded reconstruction. His measured IQ was 125. Respectable but unremarkable for someone at MIT studying theoretical physics. Yet he consistently solved problems that stumped colleagues testing at 180. Without formal training in biology, he published in biological journals. He cracked ancient Mayan writing systems using physics principles, no archaeology credentials required. He reconstructed quantum electrodynamics from the ground up, while others studied textbooks written by previous generations. What he discovered changes everything about learning, and whether credentials matter at all. Part 2. The architecture of modern education. The educational system operates on ancient architecture. Professors speak, students write, textbooks deliver information, examinations measure retention, degrees verify completion. The implicit promise: consume sufficient information, memorize adequate formulas, accumulate proper credentials, and understanding will naturally emerge. This creates a peculiar problem millions experience but struggle to articulate. You complete the certification program, you pass the examination, you update your credentials. But when someone asks you to explain the core concept without reference materials, your mind empties. When you encounter a variation of the problem not covered in the course, you're paralyzed. You borrowed the knowledge temporarily to pass an assessment. You never genuinely possessed it. Feynman documented this phenomenon in his memoir, labeling it cargo cult science, the external appearance of learning without internal substance. He observed Brazilian university students who could recite Maxwell's equations flawlessly, yet couldn't apply them to determine the electromagnetic field around a simple conducting wire. They had acquired the information. They had never constructed the understanding. Part 3. The method that seemed insane. Feynman's approach struck his MIT peers as borderline absurd. His roommate documented behavior others found incomprehensible. While classmates meticulously transcribed Wheeler's lectures, Feynman sat listening intently, then returned to his room with notebooks that appeared embarrassingly sparse. His private challenge: reconstruct Wheeler's entire lecture using only foundational principles he already grasped. His classmates possessed perfect transcripts of Wheeler's words with minimal comprehension. Feynman had imperfect notes with profound understanding. The distinction wasn't raw intelligence, it was process. He actively rebuilt knowledge rather than passively recording it. He forced his mind to perform work everyone else delegated to their note-taking. This principle transcends physics. It's about the fundamental gap between consuming information and possessing understanding, between collecting certificates and building capability. Part 4. What happened in those blank pages? Wheeler's seminar concludes at 4 in the afternoon. 20 students rush toward the library, comparing transcripts, verifying equations, ensuring comprehensive capture of every detail. Feynman walks to his dormitory alone. His notebook contains perhaps 5 lines, barely enough to trigger memory of the lecture's architecture. What followed became his concealed advantage throughout 4 years at MIT. Sitting at his desk, eyes closed, Feynman mentally replayed Wheeler's lecture. Not verbatim, that would be simple memorization. Instead, he interrogated it differently. What problem was Wheeler addressing? What assumptions enabled his solution? If I were discovering this independently, what pathway would I follow? Then came reconstruction. Beginning from basic principles already internalized, classical mechanics, calculus, electromagnetic theory, Feynman attempted to rederive Wheeler's equations independently. Sometimes his derivation aligned with Wheeler's approach. Often it diverged. The failures mattered more than the successes. As he later wrote, "I learned early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something." His classmates knew equation names. They could recite them on command. Feynman knew how equations connected to deeper principles. He could rebuild them from nothing. When he got stuck, and during those initial months, he got stuck constantly, he wouldn't immediately consult his classmates' perfect transcripts. That would undermine the entire purpose. He'd sit with the problem, sometimes for hours. The struggle itself was the education. Each failure to reconstruct revealed a gap in understanding. Each gap transformed into a specific question for the next lecture. While others collected information, Feynman rebuilt comprehension. Part 5. Why passive learning fails. The cognitive distinction is critical. Passive consumption creates what psychologists now identify as the illusion of competence. You attend a lecture, take notes, feel productive. Your brain registers this as learning. But the information enters temporary storage. Within days, most vanishes. Why? Because your brain never wrestled with the material, it just transcribed it. Active reconstruction creates durable understanding. When you attempt to rebuild knowledge from foundational principles, your brain engages at an entirely different level. You discover logical gaps. You encounter contradictions invisible when someone else explained it. You're forced to think through relationships between concepts rather than merely recording them. This explains why online courses evaporate from memory within weeks, while problems you struggle to solve remain vivid for years. The struggle engraves understanding into long-term memory. Passive viewing passes straight through. But Feynman discovered something else. This method revealed whether you actually understood something or were merely deceiving yourself. If you cannot reconstruct knowledge without consulting the source, you don't possess it yet. The blank page is ruthlessly honest. It exposes every gap, every shortcut, every fragment of borrowed understanding you haven't genuinely made your own. The same principle applies today with programming, data analysis, marketing strategy, or any complex skill. Most people watch tutorial videos, replicate the code, watch it execute successfully, and feel accomplished. Then they face a novel problem and panic. The knowledge was never theirs. They were following instructions. Feynman's method forces a different approach. Watch the tutorial once. Close it. Open a blank file. Attempt to rebuild what you observed from memory. When you fail, and initially you will fail repeatedly, analyze the failure. What principle did you miss? What connection didn't you make? Where did your logic fracture? The struggle isn't a flaw in the learning process. It is the learning process. Each successful reconstruction verifies that you own it. Each failure reveals exactly what you need to study next. But reconstruction was only the first component of Feynman's self-education system. His approach to new problems revealed an even more radical principle. Part 7. The Rebellion Against Credentials. But Feynman's rebellion against traditional education went deeper than methodology. It challenged the entire premise of what credentials actually certify. Cornell University, 1945. Feynman accepts a professorship despite an unconventional teaching philosophy that makes the administration nervous. His colleagues use standard lecture notes, carefully refined over decades. Some professors have delivered essentially identical lectures for 20 years. The system works. Why reinvent it? Feynman refuses to use anyone else's notes. More radical, he refuses to use his own notes from previous semesters. Every term, he rebuilds his lectures from scratch. Not because he forgot the material. He could teach quantum mechanics unconsciously by this point. He rebuilds because he wants to own the knowledge freshly each time. His Cornell notebooks, now archived at Caltech, reveal something startling. The same topics, Maxwell's equations, quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, explained differently each year. Not because the physics changed, but because Feynman's understanding kept evolving. He discovered new ways to think about old problems, new analogies, new connections. Each reconstruction deepened his comprehension. Students initially hated this approach. There were no perfect notes to memorize before examinations. His lectures sometimes contradicted what he'd said the previous week. He'd openly admit, "I explained this incorrectly last class. Here's why I was wrong. Here's the better way to think about it." This was terrifying for students raised in traditional education. They wanted certainty, clear answers. Feynman gave them evolving understanding and intellectual honesty about the limits of knowledge. But something remarkable happened. Over a semester's duration, students who took Feynman's courses could actually apply physics to new situations. They could solve problems they'd never encountered before. Students from conventional courses could pass tests perfectly, but froze when faced with unfamiliar scenarios. They had memorized the map. Feynman's students had learned to navigate. The difference? Feynman's students had been forced to build their own understanding by watching him build his. They couldn't just copy notes and memorize. They had to think alongside him. And because he rebuilt the knowledge each time, rather than delivering prepared lectures, they witnessed the actual process of understanding, including the mistakes and corrections. Part 8. The ultimate test. But Feynman took this principle one step further. He discovered that the ultimate test of understanding wasn't just reconstruction, it was explanation. Caltech, 1961. Richard Feynman is asked to teach introductory physics, a course usually handled by junior professors and teaching assistants. His colleagues are skeptical. Why waste a Nobel Prize winner on freshmen? Why not have him teach advanced graduate seminars where his expertise could be fully utilized? Feynman accepts immediately because he's testing a hypothesis that cuts to the heart of what understanding actually means. As he explained to the department chair, "If I can't explain something to a first-year student, then I don't really understand it myself." His preparation method became legendary among Caltech faculty. Before each lecture, Feynman would imagine explaining the concept to a 12-year-old with no background in physics. Not dumbing it down, making it genuinely clear. If he couldn't make the explanation work at that level of simplicity, he'd return to the blackboard and rederive the concept from simpler principles. This wasn't about making physics easier. It was about testing whether his understanding was real or borrowed. Jargon can hide gaps in comprehension. Complexity can mask confusion. But trying to explain quantum mechanics to someone who doesn't know calculus, that forces absolute clarity. The result of this experiment became the Feynman Lectures on Physics, published in 1964, now considered one of the greatest physics courses ever taught. Not because of advanced content, but because of radical simplicity. Feynman took concepts that usually required years of graduate study to grasp and made them accessible to 18-year-olds. His notebooks from this period, preserved in the Caltech archives, reveal the process behind this clarity. Each lecture topic has multiple failed attempts at simple explanations. Crossed out, rewritten, simplified again. He would spend hours on a single concept until he could explain it without technical jargon or circular reasoning. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote about a particularly difficult lecture on quantum electrodynamics. "I worked on this for 3 days. I couldn't reduce it to the freshman level. That means we really don't understand it." He refused to give the lecture until he found a simpler approach. Part 8. The truth they won't tell you. You don't need the university, you need the method. You don't need the degree, you need the discipline to rebuild knowledge from first principles until understanding becomes permanent. You don't need permission from institutions that profit from credential scarcity. You need blank notebooks and the courage to start from nothing. Schools won't teach you this method because it threatens their fundamental business model. It reveals an uncomfortable truth they can't acknowledge. Understanding can't be purchased with tuition or certified with diplomas. It must be built painfully through reconstruction and honest self-assessment. Feynman's blank notebooks weren't just a study technique. They were an act of intellectual rebellion, a refusal to accept that others controlled access to knowledge, a demonstration that self-education through reconstruction could produce deeper understanding than passive consumption of expert-approved content. The system told you that you needed their credentials to prove you're smart enough. Feynman proved you just needed curiosity, blank pages, and the courage to reconstruct everything yourself.